Okay, so I'm going to get rolling. My name is Richard Joy, the Executive Director for ULI Toronto. Hopefully I know many or most of you who dialed in. This is a members only webinar, the first of our series during this, this very difficult and challenging time. We've, as an organization that's known very much for producing a lot of live content, shifting very much 100% for the next while online. And we're very excited, in fact, to be using this medium to reach out to a great many of our members in a new way, as you are all doing through your businesses. So again, I'm pleased to help you. This is the launch really of our first members only webinar, designed to provide you with important insights, information, and education as we shift to this online platform during this COVID-19 global pandemic. Firstly, and most importantly, I hope that everybody on this call, their friends, their family are healthy and safe. I know that it is starting to reach closer and closer to home for many of us, and perhaps some of you have already had that impact. And you know, we're thinking of you, of course, as we all get through this together. So that's absolutely the paramount concern that we have. Before we start, I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to ask everybody to remain on mute throughout the webinar. We have a good number of people already, almost 70 people dialed in. So you'll appreciate that what we're going to try to do when we get to questions and answers is have you use the chat room. This webinar is also to be recorded as well, FYI, so we will be using it to allow audiences that come in at a later time to listen to it. And if you're using social media, particularly Twitter, our hashtag is #LeadingThroughDisruption. I'd next like to acknowledge our sponsors, our annual sponsors that are so key to our ability to continue on through these challenging times. ULI's, you know, does many things, but we're also a business, and it's very difficult for us to do a lot of live events as sort of the backbone of that business to move online. What allows us to do what we do is our annual sponsorship. So I'd like to thank them. You'll see them scrolling through fairly quickly. I apologize that we normally would have banner signs up so you could see them throughout, but we do definitely want to just acknowledge their support. Given the fog of the situation, our current times, including the certain economic consequences of the moment, we thought we would launch our webinar series with two globally connected ULI leaders with insights into other markets who are more advanced in this crisis than we are in the Toronto region. And that's, you know, specifically Asia, I think, when we think of that aspect. So I'm pleased to have introduce our two speakers. They are Peter Ballon, Global Head of Real Estate for CPP Investments. Peter is responsible for CPP's investment global real estate portfolio, which is diversified across 20 global markets and currently exceeds 50 billion Canadian. Peter is on the board of Brazilian company Allianz Sone. I hope I pronounced that right, Peter. Is a member of the, most importantly to us, a member of the global board of directors of the Urban Land Institute, and is a trustee of the International Council of Shopping Centers. Peter has over 25 years of commercial real estate experience. Prior to joining CPP IB in 2007, Peter worked with several leading real estate companies, including Canderel, Brookfield, and Trizac Hahn. Lisa Bate is the global sustainability lead and principal of B+H Architects. She's regarded as one of Canada's global ambassadors for sustainable design. A former director and board chair of the Canadian Green Building Council, Lisa is the chair of the current chair of the World Green Building Council and was representative to the United Nations Environmental Protection, Sustainable Buildings and Climate Initiative. In 2018, Lisa was named the winner of Canada's Clean 16 for the building sector at the Clean 50 Award celebration. In addition to her leadership in sustainable design, Lisa demonstrated her management abilities as managing partner for China and EVP for B+H Asia from 2012 to 2016, and was the principal in charge of the B+H team for the 2015 Pan American Games in Toronto, where she worked with the games organizers and Infrastructure Ontario to deliver 18 sports venues. So we have in our guests great insights into capital markets and great insights into the built city, giving us some really interesting span. And so I'm pleased, I'm going to take us through 4 broad questions and maybe a few detailed questions in between, and then we will turn to you, our audience, to have us drive additional Q&A up until 12:45. So Peter and Lisa, first of all, just I want to say hello to both of you. Peter, do you want to maybe give us just a little bit more detail of what you've been doing, what you are doing? Just then, I've obviously read your bio, but perhaps you could round out anything else that you might want to have our audience know just about your background.
Sure, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a bit surreal being on this webinar, but a pleasure nonetheless. As Richard mentioned, I'm on the global board of ULI. I'm very passionate about this organization. It does incredible work around the globe during good times, and I think the challenge will grow even more during tougher times. So the organization becomes even more relevant. So happy to be here. And while I have a soapbox, I want to echo Richard's comments. I hope everyone's staying safe and encourage everyone to keep everyone else safe. In terms of my role, I don't know how much more to add. I think people are somewhat familiar with CPP. We do have a global real estate business, and that has given us a good perspective in terms of the impact of the virus in other markets, notably China, of course, where it started. We have investments in South Korea, significant investments there. And so we've been able to see the impact on our portfolios as it's rolled through across the globe. We have a significant presence in Europe. We're in a lot of the sectors that are impacted materially, like shopping centers. And then we're in some sectors that are thriving, like data centers. So we've been able to get a pretty broad perspective already of the impact of the virus, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more.
Super.
At this stage, Richard, do you want me to keep going, or should I just pause?
Well, why don't you pause here, and I'll ask the same for Lisa, just to maybe round out a little bit of her perspective. But just before you do, Lisa, a point that Peter made that I'll just elaborate on. ULI, Urban Land Institute, had its origins in 1936. Our organization began in a time of economic turmoil, and so in many ways, helping industry chart their path through challenging economic times runs deep into our DNA. So it's quite appropriate that we'll be rallying around this particular time as we speak. Lisa, maybe the same question to you, just a little bit. I gave sort of the in the can bio, but maybe you could round out a little bit of your background that brings us to the conversation we're having today.
Certainly. Well, I guess what wasn't mentioned was my involvement with ULI, and ironically, the first time I was elected to something was actually in Shanghai. So in the Hong Kong chapter at the time, which is now an APAC chapter, in mainland China, there was a Shanghai Management Committee that very much connected with the Hong Kong group. So I was elected to ULI Shanghai Management Committee, sitting alongside Silverstein, Tishman Speyer, Ivanhoe Cambridge, Swayon, and lots of other global organizations. So that was really where I got quite involved in ULI. And, now definitely, Richard, looking forward to greater collaboration in the Canadian and US markets. And I did speak at the ULI Spring Conference in Seattle a few years ago as well. And just maybe a little bit more background on the B+H part. So B+H is a Canadian founded company established in 1953. So we're coming up to our 70th year soon, and started operations in China in 1992. So coming up to our 30 years. And we do have other offices, studios in throughout Asia and also in the Middle East, US as well. So I think that's probably
Perfect.
enough for us
No,
to
that's
get
wonderful.
going.
Thank you. And well, so my question first question I'm gonna ask for both of you is let's take us back to, let's say, just before the COVID-19 crisis hit us, and I get your perspectives on where did you see our industry at that point in time? How strong were the economic fundamentals? Where were some of the weak spots, perhaps, on the same notion? Where were we, if we were to dial the clock back, whether that's a month or 3 months, where did we find ourselves before this health pandemic hit us? Peter, I'll start with you.
All right. Okay. It seems like such a long time ago. So it's hard to imagine that we've only been kind of in the trenches here in North America for the last 3-4 weeks. Of course, globally, it started much earlier in China. In terms of the fundamentals, there's no doubt we were late cycle. And by the way, my comments are a little bit are beyond Canada. They apply to Canada, but my perspective is trying to include different parts of the world and different sectors. And there's no doubt we're late cycle. It's been a great run since the GFC. And prior to the pandemic, real estate was trading for the most part in almost every sector at all-time highs, very aggressive pricing. We at CPP have been net sellers despite a considerable availability of capital. We've actually been net sellers over the last 2 years, which reflects our concern in terms of where pricing was. But it wasn't homogeneous across sectors. There were clearly challenges and headwinds facing sectors like enclosed malls that were very much challenged by e-commerce. There were sectors like logistics, which had the tailwinds associated with e-commerce that were thriving virtually in every single market around the world. There were other sectors that were being disrupted, and we can talk about that in a few minutes. People were talking about, WeWork as a great news story, and of course it failed for other reasons prior to the pandemic, but the model was still a robust model that people thought was completely immune to markets. And I think we're going to learn a little bit more in the coming weeks and months, whether that's true or not. And so the market, I'd say if you're in real estate, you were feeling good about yourself for the most part, if you weren't in the enclosed mall sector. I'll just pause there as a macro perspective.
Okay, great. Maybe Lisa, the same question to you. Where do you see things from your perspective, design firm working globally prior to the pandemic?
Interestingly enough, I echo what Peter is saying. Definitely, hospitality, aviation sector, retail, workplace, mixed use, transitory development, everything was on hyper development. When we look at Asia, China, Hong Kong, South China, lots of hospitality, but also healthcare, big infrastructure spends, lots of development. Same in Vietnam, Singapore really rising up. The outward bound investment from Singapore through big development groups, Temasek owned companies and others. And then in North America, we were really looking at the US with Seattle and West Coast. Same for all of the sectors that I'm talking about. In Ontario and Toronto and GTAA, there was a certain point, not sure now, that we had more active cranes in the downtown core than any other city in the world. We know with the planned ULI Spring Conference and many other international conferences, ones from Europe that were even around retail, but in the building and construction sector, the spring to fall a number of conferences that were due here. A little bit more east, I mean, in the national region with Ottawa, tremendous initiatives like the National Archives building, which is being built as a net zero carbon P3. So still big focus on climate action, net zero carbon, decarbonization throughout the building construction sector, better places for people, indoor air quality. Quebec, big infrastructure spends, healthcare, hospitals, sport complexes. Vancouver, West Coast prairies, also kind of on hyperspeed with big international investment and population growth. And so I think that, if you do that kind of scan across Canada and globally, we were all, sailing pretty fast and high.
Okay, so let's pivot to today. And I know these are early days, and I'm not asking either of you to be looking into the crystal ball or economists, but clearly we have been disrupted on most of those fronts. What do you see, though, looking at some of the parts of the world, especially Asia, which were disrupted earlier than we? What do you see as some of the things we might expect, or what could you tell us about some of the things we might learn from those jurisdictions in the nearer term, in terms of riding through perhaps the worst of the storm at this point, keeping in mind that that storm may last a long time and there may be a second storm. But what early lessons are we picking up from those jurisdictions? Perhaps we'll go to Peter on this one.
Sure. Before I refer to what's happening in Asia, et cetera, as maybe a window of the future, I think it's worthwhile reflecting on where we are today. And I, as you can imagine with my background, I've got a very much capital markets orientation. And if we look to the public markets, which often get it wrong, but I think it's a very clear indicator what the public markets is saying, real estate has clearly been one of the hardest hit sectors as a result of the virus. We operate in a very physical world, and in a physical world that people are confined to their homes, clearly that is not good for our asset class. Within our physical world, there have been, I'd say, very few winners, data centers being one of the sole winners, and the rest are down. And if you look at what's been hurt the most, clearly hospitality, the hotel business obviously is getting crushed, which is known for being a very volatile sector. Shopping centers that are currently closed, that's not good for a big sector that's already struggling. I'd say one of the surprises, well, not surprises, obviously because it's a health crisis, but everyone always considered the health sector, so specifically seniors housing, as being a reasonably resilient sector during a financial crisis. And of course, this isn't exactly a financial crisis. Of course, it's driven by health, and that's another sector. And we can talk about that afterwards, but the question is, okay, so that's what's impacted today. What's going to be impacted going forward is a more challenging question. But what we've seen already, getting to your question, we had a lot of closed malls in China. We had logistics. We have a lot under construction and logistics in China. All those sites where construction was stopped. And the good news in the Chinese market and for Chinese people in terms of health recovery, that issue is slowly getting resolved. Our construction sites are resuming. Factories are opening up again. Our shopping malls are opening. Although I would acknowledge that people aren't yet coming in droves. I think there's still a social concern in terms of people still trying to keep their distance, etc. So it's going to take some time to get people to feel comfortable with the new norm and confident to go out, etc. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel in China now. But I don't want to suggest, that what we're seeing in China will automatically happen here. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences.
Fair enough. Lisa, where about yourself on some of the things you're seeing in the nearer term, particularly perhaps from the type of work that you do? You were going like gangbusters. Are you still, or is it slowed down? And what insights from your work, your firm's work in Asia could you offer?
Well, it's really interesting because it's really the East leading the West, with them being ahead of us. We are seeing tremendous hope coming out of Asia. Our backlog of work globally is healthy. As I say this, I'm crossing my fingers. In Shanghai, we're back to full operations. It's interesting. I think what we're trying to do everywhere is following government directives and initiatives, and obviously certain government structures fare differently and better than others. And obviously with China, lockdowns and now with the back to work, we could have reopened our offices in Shanghai in the week of February 10th. We chose to keep them closed for a week. When people went back to work for the building that our Shanghai operations are in, as well as Hong Kong and our Shenzhen group, it is having your temperature taken at the door. When you're in China and so many places, you walk on those pads that take your temperature after SARS. It came about in 2003. So at the office entries, it's actually with ear thermometers. We had 2 people that weren't allowed to return back to work on February 17th, which was from a temperature taking physician. One had a cold. So they thought it was a risk to them. And the other person we did find out was going through actually chemotherapy in the fall. And so they weren't allowed back. They are now back to work. In Ho Chi Minh City, our operations, it is under work from home protocols. Our IT group, which is currently a fan favorite globally, people that didn't really understand what these folks do now, they're are definitely our frontline workers, and they were able to get, in places like China and Vietnam, where a lot of people don't have home computers or don't have laptops, getting everybody set up remotely. So in Vietnam, they're still under that work, but we just want a significant full city block development as well. MENA, Middle East, North Africa, our Dubai operations, they seem to be working from home, but it's somewhat business as usual. I would say our Singapore group, are working, they're doing I think it's 2/3 from home, 1/3 in the office, and back and forth. But I just think everywhere we're just really trying to follow the business directives that we're being given by government. I think in the West, we're still trying to figure out what this means. As I'm saying, we're being hopeful with what we're seeing coming out of China, but I think our sort of business as usual model is sunsetting. And I think we also are not used to being told what to do. When we see what's happening in certain countries, telling Americans, Italians, and Spaniards they have to stay home. So I think, where you're seeing some of the spikes still continuing to happen is because telling spring break college students that they can't go on the beach, I think that's a part that we're all struggling with. But I do think we all are getting much better at connectivity and social media, and
right.
The house party app has become a way for people to have 5 o'clock drinks or to connect with families and so on and so forth. So I think it's evolving, but I do think the East is leading us and helping us.
So Lisa, one of the reasons it was so fascinating to have you on this call, given your environmental leadership and background, if there was no question that before this public health emergency hit us, the meta issue of our time was climate change, and arguably it still is. But now maybe we have competing meta issues that are affecting our industry. And I'm curious now. In the last question I said I didn't want you to ask you to look into the crystal ball, so maybe in this question I am asking you a little bit to do just that. But how do you see the tension? And I say tension because I think that there's potentially some pretty significant conflicts between these two meta issues. If the answer to climate change from city building perspective is higher density and mass transit and things like that, those are things that might run into conflict with social distancing and the hangover of this public health crisis we're going through. Thoughts on the longer term to you, Lisa, and then I'll turn to next back to you, Peter. And before I just also want to say to people on the line, after this, I'm going to be looking for questions through the chat room. So if you all want to be thinking about some questions, now's a great time to put those forward. Lisa.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, obviously, I am incredibly anxious that, the focus on climate action, climate deterioration, and making sure that we decarbonize our world and make better places for people will take a back seat. But I have always seen pandemics as part of a climate crisis. I think, how do we stop our protectionism that we're kind of have embedded in our DNA to not trench back to business as usual and use this to leverage the lessons that we know from science and not just, I think I'm saying Martin Luther King's phrase, justice ideologies of ignorance. So we do know that pandemics were always envisioned through climate crisis, and how do we use this time to focus on how we control, how we fluid-proof and future-proof the cause so we can better control the effect. So I think there are strong lessons learned from this, and I think staying away from NIMBYism and protectionism, and because I think when we're looking at anxiety and mental health and healthcare and all of these things, it is one big ecosystem that all have to do with this. And when you're talking about densification from a sustainability aspect, it was known about personal distancing. It is known, especially in the East, about safe distancing for things as well. So I do think it's just, maybe this has made us have to realize that whole climate, the people, planet, and profit is completely interconnected, and I think that's the piece that we really have to focus on.
We're definitely going to explore that some more in the coming weeks. Peter, maybe the same lens, just to remind that sort of the longer too. There's a question actually that already has come in from Stephen and John. Do you think that they see a permanent change in the demand for office space per employee? I think many organizations are realizing that work from home or flexible work is actually working quite well. So maybe built into your broader answer, maybe if you could give us your thoughts on that specific question. And then I have also another question from Stephen to Lisa that I'll come back to. Go ahead, Peter.
Sure. And let me answer, as you point out, the question more broadly. I think a lot is up in the air right now. I think, unlike financial crisis, I think this change in habits has changing people's mindsets. How long that lasts, it's hard to predict. But I do think we need to all step back as real estate participants and try to anticipate what will change as a result of this. The answer might turn out to be, in the medium to long term, absolutely nothing. Even something as dramatic like seniors' homes, which are really suffering a terrible, and I'm not talking about financially, but just the experiences, the news, etc., would suggest that no one would ever want to be in a senior home. There was a reason for senior homes before, and so the easy reaction today would be no more senior homes. We need to find other solutions, or only people who have no choice, and that's not good for a business model. So the important thing is not to jump to conclusions. People will take airplanes again, and maybe even someone will take a cruise at some point, although probably no one on this line is signing up anytime soon. So it's too early to put the death knell into even the most obvious ones. And then maybe addressing Stephen's question, I mean, that is one of the sectors that you have to wonder, what is the impact to the office business? We have all learned that we can work reasonably effectively from home. We can debate whether everyone likes it or not. If you live in a large home with space, etc., maybe it's even better. You avoid the commute. I can tell you that, without getting too personal, my colleagues in Hong Kong did not like working in their homes. They don't live, homes in general, just across the board, whether wealthy or less affluent, are not the same size in all markets. And to be honest, a lot of the single people in our office, even here in Toronto, who have roommates, everyone's working on the phone at the same time and it's not working, and there's confidential information being heard in the background. It's not quite perfect. And so I think it's still early to tell. There's examples with IBM. They went to a model with no offices, and then until pre-pandemic, this trend was to attract and retain the best talent. You needed cool space where people would bump into each other and communicate that way. So the quick answer is I wouldn't jump to any conclusions now, but we have to ask ourselves those questions.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so quick question to Lisa from Melissa Ricci. Have you noticed a different reaction from the public sector in different locations where you work in terms of how they continue to operate business as usual? So are you seeing different jurisdictions, public sector, reacting differently than the private sectors in those jurisdictions? Do you have insight into that?
Yes, certainly, especially I would say in Canada for sure. We definitely are seeing our institutional sector work continuing. You know, it's funny, but once again in Canada, I'm saying that because once again, education, healthcare that are publicly owned, aviation, you know, and it's a good time right now to do construction at airports. They can accelerate with stakeholders being the airlines and customers not there. But we do have unions in terms of construction sector suggesting that, you know, construction has been determined to be an essential service. So then engineers and architects doing periodic review obviously are then an essential service. But we're seeing unions definitely asking about, you know, what is a safe work environment? So we're definitely seeing that. We have seen our hospitality work definitely right away things went on hold, but we are also hearing from some of our longstanding, our more interior design group, the Chill group, that do global work with a lot of known brands. We are seeing that they're saying this is a great time to actually look at renovating rooms because, you know, we've got you know, availability to actually do so. Retail, same, we weren't as active right now, but in Asia, it's starting to ramp up again a little bit in China. But as Peter said, they aren't seeing people all coming back and congregating or just happy to get out. We have the same issue with our Asian operations and our Middle Eastern operations, that people live in quite small homes. And I do know just with my own family, you know, one of my kids living in a 15th floor of a condo building can't get in the elevator if somebody else is in it because the elevators are 6x8. So, you know, I think it is very regionally focused that way.
Another question related to the public sector from Angela Clayton asking about what we're seeing in terms of stimulus spending. In the last global economic downturn, there was massive stimulus spending. What are you seeing, either of you, perhaps start with Peter, as being the response on that front to stimulate the economy on the other side of this?
I would say it's still an early stage. So in Asia, and we're generalizing, let me focus on China, there has been some stimulus, but I wouldn't call it a material stimulus. The impact in China, the good news was reasonably brief, and so it was a very what they're calling a V-shaped recovery, whereby by the time they were working on stimulus, the market was already recovering because, as I mentioned, people are going back to work, the factories are opening up, etc. Whether that can be sustained because their exports are going to drop as Europe and the Americas drop off as buyers as we go through this, that's still to be questioned. But the quick answer is I don't think there's been a lot of stimulus to my knowledge. We're all reading similar information in terms of what the US is planning. They are planning considerable stimulus with Europe, but it's not being enacted. We're active in India. There's talk about it there, but I wouldn't see the dollars. The challenge with infrastructure and stimulus is that it happens very slowly. And I think are focused much more on immediate stimulus. And in the case of certainly what we're seeing in Canada and the US is really, it's even less stimulus, but just almost support for those people who are losing their jobs and their businesses. So it's got a much short-term softening as opposed to a medium and long-term, which is what infrastructure is.
Right, right. Well, and you wonder whether governments are have the same fiscal capacity they'd had last time, when there's so much short-term bleeding going on fiscally, as they are sort of shoring up society, in the most immediate way, that they may not be in the same position that they would have been in previous times.
Right. I mean, you don't have lower interest rates to solve the solution anymore. So they are looking for other short-term solutions. And infrastructure is a great medium term. It should be the right answer, but unfortunately, it's got a longer lead time in terms of employment, et cetera, which is what's really needed right now.
Okay. There was a more nuanced question on the seniors care, but I think I'm going to maybe just what I'm going to do is package up that question and send it to you if you'd be willing to answer it offline, Peter. But one of the things that Laura Sellers is asking is how are you both leading your firms differently, your companies, and how are your companies leading more broadly differently now that we're in the midst of this crisis? What have you focused on as leaders? And that doesn't necessarily have to be an industry leadership. It could be corporate culture and so forth. What are some of your messages that you're giving your staff? Things that might just be have suddenly changed in leadership style and culture.
You want me to start, Richard?
Sure. Sorry, I should have said that. Yes.
That's okay. Well, we are a lot more connected globally for sure. We are having 3 senior leadership team COVID-19 meetings a week. We're having weekly town halls led by our CEO as of January. Interestingly enough, our Toronto and Shanghai studios are both scheduled to move this summer. So we are now rapidly prototyping what does this new model mean? How do people feel about social distancing? What do these new studios look like? So I think, immediately when this happened, we've always seen that people are our assets. We're a consulting practice, so people are our assets. And it's really just making sure that everybody is taken care of and that all questions are getting answered. So I think that's what we immediately went focused on was that.
Interesting. Peter.
I would separate it into, many of us, or at least I'll include myself, are old enough to unfortunately have gone through many downturns. So downturns in themselves aren't really new. They're not new to real estate. And in fact, it's obviously very natural. There's that component of it, but I think it's important to recognize what's unique about this situation, and that is the isolation and the anxiety that's coming. Well, people might be anxious about their businesses, which happens in a typical downturn. In this scenario, people are, there's anxiety about, obviously from a health perspective. I have colleagues who have COVID as we speak, and and there's a certain anxiety. People probably are starting to know people, and maybe thankfully less so here in the Americas, but for those of us that are in other markets, it's a normal occurrence. And so there's a lot of anxiety, et cetera. And so what we're acknowledging and making sure is first take care of the people. If our people are taken care of, then we know the business will be taken care of. And so repeating Lisa's point, first of all, there's a certain empathy. Secondly, I used to always talk about that we're based in 7 offices around the world, where now we're based in 80 offices because we have 80 investment professionals, and I'm referring to the real estate. DPP is 1,700 people and 1,700 different offices. And so the key part of this is communication. We have regular, as Lisa was saying, calls. I've now opened up everything that's normally among smaller, more senior groups. Everything is transparent. There's no secrets. We'll have debates in front of large groups and just make sure that everyone feels part of this challenge. We are taking, and then within that, once we have things under control, and we're breaking ourselves down into subcommittees, which is a combination of to get to better answers and decision making, but also for people to feel more part of a group as they kind of deal through the struggle. So I'm happy to talk about the business side of it, but that's kind of the leadership. On the leadership specifically, it's important to keep the troops calm, explain to them that from a business perspective, cycles are natural, and that if you're calm and thoughtful, not only is it, not a terrible thing. In fact, and we're not trying to be opportunistic, but cycles do create business opportunities, and we need to be mindful of that.
Fascinating. Thank you. We're getting close to the end here, and I want to just sort of leave our audience with an understanding of some of the things that are to come. A lot of questions have been not asked because they came in fast and furiously, and so, but what they are going to be, we're going to harvest those questions for future webinars. We're going to be doing a lot of them. Also podcasts. We're using the online content heavily. It's highly successful. In fact, we're finding we're reaching an even larger audience than we do in our normal model, which is will be an interesting post-mortem when all this is said and done. I also want you to know that ULI is working with our sister organizations. We've come together with the NAOPS and other RealPAC and others to begin to mobilize how we can scale our local industry response to pandemic effort led by government. So that's something that I want you to stay tuned to. We also have a whole lot of webinar series coming forward that's going to tuck into some of these questions that have been asked, like the question of, is it the end of density? In fact, the future of density is our next webinar next Wednesday, led by Ryerson City Building Institute, who we partnered on for a weekly series into the future. So lots and lots of opportunity for us to address the kinds of questions that have been coming at us, and lots of opportunities that we'll be asking of you to provide your own leadership to this effort locally in the coming weeks. So stay tuned to that. And with that, I'd really like to thank again Lisa Bate and Peter Ballon for taking the time to do this with us on very short notice. Fascinating insights for us as we share our experiences with each other. Really, really helpful. So thank you both. And thank you to all our audience who dialed into this first of many webinars, member-only webinars. All the best.
Thanks, Richard, and thank everyone for the questions.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And sorry, it was hard to track the questions, and hopefully we'll get sent them, Richard, so we can look at them. Thank you.
We'll definitely do that. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.